1953, 70 years ago. Dwight Eisenhower was the U.S. president. New York Yankees legend Mickey Mantle was hitting grand slams. Marilyn Monroe was the Queen of Hollywood, and a young royal named Elizabeth became the Queen of England. And the Today Show aired its very first episode on NBC. 1953 was also a year when dozens of local television stations started hitting the airwaves, including what we now know as WJHG in Panama City, Florida. WJHG's history goes back to the beginnings of broadcast affiliates. In the 1930s and 40s, NBC, CBS, and ABC laid the path for broadcast news. But it wasn't until after World War II that local broadcast stations really began to take off. By 1955, almost 500 TV stations were on the air in the United States, including WJHG, which launched as WJDM on December 1st, 1953. Originally owned by businessman J.D. Manley, who named the station after his initials, though others remember it a different way.
WJDM, wait just a darn minute. And I'm bringing in darn rather than the other word.
Bill Hudson is a Panama City video historian and former videographer for WJHG.
Looking back on it, it's history. At the time, it was a job. But now it's history.
Paris Janos started working at WJHG as the art director in 1979. But growing up in Bay County, he remembers the days long before that.
So WJDM, it was small TV station, startup. They moved at one point. JHG went downtown, and then they built a small studio here, and they came back, and then they went. But they went from downtown to back here, and that's why we have our main studio, and we still have that building out back that was once, I think it was WJHG at the time.
Video from the station from the 1950s and 60s is hard to find, as most was not preserved.
That was before videotape, and Bill Hudson and others would shoot film, and they would have to put it in this machine, and it would actually process the film. So a lot of it was film, and that's why we don't have videotapes to plug in. And
I wish I had saved film from every story I ever did.
In the 1950s, the station secured its primary affiliation with NBC, and James Harrison Gray, a businessman from Albany, Georgia, bought the Panama City station in 1960, switching its call letters to his initials, WJHG.
James Harrison Gray is what WJHG stands for. I knew Jimmy Gray. I've shot pictures at his wedding, in fact. Jimmy was the mayor of Albany, Georgia. He also owned WALB. He also owned the newspaper. They since have broken that up. And he also had a beach house down here. He used to fly down here every weekend, or he loved to be in the sun.
By the 1970s, the world was changing, and archives began keeping track of the stories we covered on the local news. A time when Carter was president, the Vietnam War was ending, and Panama City Beach was bustling, with attractions like Petticoat Junction, Miracle Strip Amusement Park, and the Miracle Strip Tower dotting the coastline.
Good evening. It's the beginning of the end for the Dead Lakes Dam in Weewahitchka after 4 years of legal battles.
But there was Jim Ty, Hadaway, Hutto, and Hips, the three H's. And between those three, you never knew what was going to happen.
When I started, it was Earl Hutto, Earl Hadaway, Joe Moore, Tom Hips.
The longest-serving anchor at WJHG was Joe Moore. For 43 years, he worked as a reporter, anchor, news director, vice president of news, even station manager, until his retirement in 2014. Moore passed away 1 year later.
My biggest memory of Joe Moore is his integrity. He honestly believed you should do the right thing on the news, that you should not let your personal beliefs or feelings interfere with the message that people need to hear.
Joe was very easygoing. Why he didn't fire me 14 times, I'll never know.
When we come back, we'll dive into the 1970s and 80s, an era where local news became a constant in most American households. And we'll take you on a trip through some of the biggest stories making local headlines.
70 Years with WJHG is sponsored in part by Peden.
The 1970s. It was a time when big local stories were caught by the lens at WJHG. The infamous Sandy Creek murders, where a massive drug smuggling operation led to the murders of 4 locals. Actress Barbara Eden was in the area filming the movie Condominium. And a disc jockey named Jim King set a world record by riding the Miracle Strip roller coaster for 7 days and nights. As the 1980s approached, the local economy rode the ups and downs.
Later this week, the 76 employees of this manufacturing plant will lose their jobs, victims of worsening economic conditions that are being felt throughout the country.
Stories about jobs and industry.
And clean, safe communities make the Bay County area a perfect place to raise a family.
People like to work where they like to live.
Military. Politics.
I met President Reagan, Carter, Gerald Ford.
And tourism, reflecting the fabric of a community as seen through local news.
You stop and think of the national events that have happened here in Bay County. Could be a train wreck, could be a hurricane, presidential visit. We've had tons of national stories in this county. And it's just been, you stop and think about it, it's amazing. And I was there for a lot of them.
Bill Hudson's most memorable story was in the early 1980s as 2 people held up the local pharmacy, City Drugs, and Hudson became part of the story as he was taken hostage.
Yep. There we go, buddy. Step. You can I make a mistake?
But those who told the stories and captured those moments remember the good times covered in the area far more than the bad. Paris Janos reflects on shows like Daybusters with Tom Hips, a show he worked on for years that helped start the day for many locals.
Now, the Daybuster show, people could walk in the back door and say, "Hey, Tom, can you get me on the air today?" And Tom would go, "Come on in, look, here's Joe from Joe's Hardware. Have a seat, Joe." And Joe would get on and he'd talk. And by the way, Tom, I'm having a sale today. And it was very fly by the seat of your pants. And I loved it. I loved every minute of that.
The 80s marked a time when television, in many ways, was entering a heyday.
That time, the golden age of TV for this area.
In 1972, WJHG switched from NBC to ABC, but by the early 80s it was back to NBC and has been the area's NBC affiliate ever since.
Good news. You ready?
I guess so.
The Tonight Show welcomes WJHG-TV, Panama City, Florida. They rejoined NBC as an affiliate on January 4th.
Stories in the 1980s covered a rapidly changing area as mom-and-pop businesses and large, pristine beachfront properties were sold for what was a lot of money at the time.
The entire estate consists of 22 businesses located along 2,687 feet of scenic Highway 98, as well as nearly 1/4 of a mile of prime beachfront property. Conservative estimates put that property's value at a sum of several $1 million.
Technology was booming, but in many ways still very basic.
Very rudimentary. So everything was done by hand. I had to take a photo of it with 35mm camera. I had to process the film, cut it up into slides. The slides went into what was called the film chain, which was essentially a slide projector that went over the air, and an 8-track cassette tape carried the audio. So that was back in the day.
And the Chinook winds are sort of melting some of that snow conditions, and at the same time it's causing a snow melt.
Also drawn by hand, the weather maps, as forecasting in the early days was quite different than today. Chief Meteorologist Chris Smith started at WJHG 15 years ago, long after the early days.
I can't even imagine. I mean, I've seen so many changes in my career. So I started off, almost 30 years ago. I've seen huge changes in my career. But going back before that, you're talking about, when you used to have almost like chalkboards or magnet boards. That's how they did the weather.
WJHG quickly became the go-to source for local weather information as hurricanes like Eloise in 1975 and Kate in 1985 further changed the local landscape.
The Round Towner was a victim of Hurricane Eloise in 1975, as were many homes and motels on the beach.
Our cameras were rolling on the historic snowstorm of 1989 as well.
And I remember the snow event back in 1989, and they would show the radar, and you could see, it almost looked like, flies on a little monitor or something. You're like, what is that? But, that's just the start of it.
There's a change in the weather at TV7 News. The new Kavoris graphic system will offer viewers a new look at weather information.
And our technology kept evolving.
When things went to computer as far as the artwork was concerned, it made everything go from a several-hour project to just a few minutes, depending on what was needed.
And what was needed was more news to feed the growing appetite of viewers, depending on WJHG to keep them up to date with what was happening at the national, state, and local level.
I remember, too, when we came in, we still had the AP machines in the newsroom, and the paper would overflow, and that was kind of like the stereotype of a newsroom when you hear that sound, and when you hear that classic clicking and clacking of the AP machine, you knew you were in a newsroom, by golly.
Hello again, everybody. For the 30th time in the history of the Florida State-Florida rivalry, the two schools will bang heads on Saturday on the football field.
The 80s didn't just see an explosion in news coverage. Sports also became a very important part of the newscast and the community. Scott Rossman has been shooting sports since he started at WJHG in 1987.
Joe Moore recruited me. I had recently graduated from the University of Florida, and it was among the markets that I had sent tape out to.
The 80s saw sports grow right along with the local communities.
Any community that you go to, it kind of identifies itself with its sports teams. I mean, go to Tallahassee, Florida right now, and everywhere you go, you're going to see garnet and gold. Go down to Gainesville, and everywhere you go, you're going to see orange and blue and that logo. It's certainly that way in Northwest Florida.
The Gulf Coast provided the perfect climate for a growing sports industry.
Like a high school baseball team will play a summer schedule. A high school basketball team will play a summer schedule. High school volleyball, they compete year-round now. And that's really been a nice thing in terms of, what we have available to us to cover, because that's, again, the viewers want to see it.
In 1984, the first Bay Point Billfish tournament was held.
And by the late 80s and early 90s, it had become one of the jewels of the billfish sporting community along the Gulf Coast of not just Florida, but Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. I mean, the big fishing teams were all coming here year in and year out for decades.
The summer tradition evolved into a 70-boat Billfish Invitational, a massive tournament that took place annually until 2012. It was just revived again in 2023. The sun and surf provided the perfect playground for more than just sports. The late 80s and early 90s brought a new kind of visitor to the local beaches, college spring breakers.
It got out of control. It really got out of control.
When we come back, we'll take you from the 80s into the 90s as we travel through the big stories making local history through the lens of WJHG. As the 1980s rolled into the 1990s, the world was changing, and news was changing too. More women were being hired as main anchors.
Northwest Florida's news channel, WJHG, welcomes Nisa Wilkins to our News Channel 7 team. Nisa joins veteran news anchor and news director Joe Moore on the set as co-anchor, weekdays at 6 p.m.
Nisa Wilkins started at WJHG in 1993 and remembers that day well.
Now, when I was hired, I was told that Joe Moore had never had a co-anchor before, much less a female co-anchor. And so I was a first in that aspect here, and I loved getting to do that and you know, start the ball rolling for the ones who have come behind me.
But sometimes change takes a little getting used to.
And there were a lot of adjustments to be made. You know, Joe was not used to having someone with him. And I remember a phone call we got like the first or second night that I was on the air. Some woman called and said, "Who is the blonde that keeps interrupting Joe Moore?" So that's always been a joke between Joe and me because, you know, I was the first one, and he always liked to joke with me about that. You know, you taught me a whole lot, Nisa. I'm like, no, I think it's the other way around. You were my mentor.
The newscast wasn't the only thing changing, so were the visitors coming to Panama City Beach.
Panama City Beach decided that, hey, we can take spring break and make it something good. We can make a lot of money off of it, and we can help our local businesses. And it was good, but after a while, as happens, I can't blame any one person, and I'm not the person to do that anyway, but it got overwhelming.
It wasn't crazy back then other than the traffic. And it was tame, you know, the kids were just here to have fun. But oh my goodness, a few years later.
By the early 1990s, what was once a small tourist town was getting noticed around the world as an emerging spring break capital, putting Panama City Beach on the map.
Next thing you know, MTV is here, and it's getting broadcast all over the country. And young people and music groups and artists of different, you know, hip hop and rap and everything were all coming here that probably would never have come here prior to that, and local people got the chance to see them. Whoa, this is cool, you know. But it also brought in more people from the outside, and it got out of hand.
But MTV wasn't the only national spotlight shining on the area. Hollywood also took notice. The budding new town of Seaside, nestled along 30A, became the backdrop for a blockbuster.
The Truman Show, that's pretty cool that they saw that Seaside was such a great location to film that with Jim Carrey.
That movie gave people a glimpse of the beauty along the Emerald Coast, which was lined by pristine sand dunes, until one big storm washed ashore.
And I remember Hurricane Opal was the first time that I had lived through a hurricane, and we worked in such sync during that horrible time, horrible event in Bay County and surrounding counties. And that's one thing that Joe Moore told me. He said, when we have a disaster here, we work together, not just the station, but the community.
Opal was known for its storm surge, decimating sand dunes and creating catastrophic beach erosion. The first major beach renourishment project in Panama City Beach started after that storm, as local leaders saw the need to protect one of the area's biggest moneymakers, the tourism industry. But Opal wiped out more than just sand dunes. It marked an end to many small hotels, restaurants, and landmarks.
Seeing the Miracle Strip Tower come down was pretty emotional for me, because that represented our area. That was, when you saw a drawing or an illustration or a photograph of Panama City Beach, Miracle Strip Tower was right there. It was the focus point.
When it came down in '95, I can remember there was a lot of people there watching. I can remember people saying, I had my first kiss up there. I had another person say, that's when my husband proposed to me. It was just good feelings like that, but it was also sad to see it gone.
At WJHG, typewriters were being replaced by computers, and the internet opened up a whole new way to view the area. Meanwhile, at WJHG, our cameras were keeping up with the action, and the 1990s revolutionized local newsrooms.
You know, so many of the kids we work with today, you know, have never heard the sound of a typewriter. You know, an IBM Select Type, you know, that kind of thing.
Our newscasts were morphing into a modern age. Newscasts were added in the early morning and midday hours and expanding at 10 p.m. and weekends. As the community grew, so did the need for news. WJHG saw history in the making as Air Force One landed at Tyndall Air Force Base.
And here is President Clinton as he steps off of Air Force One.
Governor Childs.
Governor Childs is right behind him.
Bill Clinton was one of many U.S. presidents to visit the area, and coverage turned long form as microwave trucks made extended coverage possible. And the stories were high profile. A medical examiner named Dr. Cybers accused of killing his wife, 4 shot at the Show and Tell strip club, and an explosion at the Panama City mill.
The flag flew at half-mast at Stone Containers paper mill following Wednesday's explosion that killed 2 and left 1 missing.
And O.J. Simpson playing golf in Panama City Beach after being acquitted of the infamous murder of his wife.
Within a day or two of the verdict, maybe it was 3 or 4 days later, I don't exactly remember when, O.J. Simpson pops up in Panama City playing golf at the Hombre Golf Club. O.J. had continued a relationship with the person that was here, that lived here, and I think he had calculated that perhaps a good place to show back up that wasn't a major media market was Panama City. The phone rings at about 6:15 in the morning and Joe says, "Hey Scott, somebody over at the Hombre has called me and said you really need to get down there." And he couldn't tell me why. This is Joe Moore talking to me over the phone. And I said, "What's that? What do you think that's about?" And he said, "I think O.J. Simpson is out at the Hombre." And now remember, now the whole world was wondering where O.J. Simpson was. He had vanished. He had left Southern California, and we get ahead of them. They had played 8 holes, and we got up to where a short par 3 was hole number 10. And we knew that he would have to come right towards us, and the path led us to a spot where we set the tripod up, and there we were. And there's O.J. with some of his security people, and then another person that he was here to visit, and they passed right by, and I'll never forget O.J. The car didn't stop and went right by our tripod, and he said, "Hello, Panama City," and he rode by, and we continued to get video of it.
Hey, Panama City. Later.
That moment, caught on camera, went viral at a time before anyone even knew what viral video meant.
Sure enough, get back to the station. Our GM had already sold that video for tens of thousands of dollars all over the world. I mean, the BBC, ITN, South American television, Spanish language news, Australian News 1. I mean, every entity in the world that was broadcasting news wanted that video.
Sports also dominated the headlines as the 1996 Olympics took place in Atlanta. WJHG anchor Joe Moore was one of several locals to run with the torch as it passed through Bay County.
But it was really kind of neat, and the fact that he ran right by the station here was really, you have to hand it to the ACOG, the Atlanta Committee of the Olympic Games, and NBC, NBC Sports. They tailor-made they knew where the affiliate was, and they arranged to where that torch would run right by our front door. So that made it even more significant.
WJHG's sports team covered athletes big and small, including a group of young boys who made it into the spotlight, the 1996 R.L. Turner Little League team. They made it all the way to Williamsport for the Little League World Series.
We started to get an idea that this team could wind up going to Williamsport. It's probably, it's right up there, one of the 2 or 3 biggest sports stories in my 37 years here. A group of kids from Bay County gathering together and practicing hard and dedicating themselves and making it to Williamsport in the Little League World Series.
A time when backyard baseball started taking a turn as the area started seeing the birth of more ballparks.
Well, you have to credit the folks, and I don't know who was responsible for, making the decision to bring Frank Brown Park into being. But whoever that idea came from, credit him or her and say, wow, you put a facility out there, and it's a first-class facility for our region.
That paved the way for a sports marketing industry in our area.
Helped with the development of the public sports park, which now has expanded the idea of Frank Brown Park. More ball fields and more events and turf fields.
WJHG also covered many stories at local military bases, important training grounds in the 90s, years before 9/11. The late 90s also saw the development of the F-22, the newest and most elite fighter of the time, as it prepared to settle into its training ground at Tyndall Air Force Base. And our cameras were rolling as a local woman, Sherry Lynn Olds, was brought home and laid to rest.
Sherry loved Panama City and Tyndall Air Force Base, and she spent most of her career here.
It was a senseless crime that took her life. Sherry was one of 12 Americans killed in the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Kenya.
We are waiting because in just a few minutes, former President George Bush will be here and he'll be speaking on the platform behind me. The millennium was a time when WJHG cameras captured countless political events, both big and small. This is certainly a tight race. Do you think there could be a difference between the popular vote and the electoral votes this time?
No, I don't think so. I really don't. You keep hearing that every few years. And once in a while it happens, but I really don't think that's going to happen.
When we come back, we'll enter a new millennium and the changes that came after 9/11, as seen through the lens of WJHG.
70 Years with WJHG is sponsored in part by Peden.
Y2K.
Clint Lumpkin and his partner spent $65 to make sure their two computers would work when they needed them on the Monday after New Year's Eve.
Everyone feared technology was going to be upended as the new year rolled into the millennium. And news coverage was ready to go for the big story that wasn't. As we entered into the new century, WJHG's cameras were rolling as a presidential race became local news. All right. Former President Bush, how important is it that your son win the state of Florida?
Well, every state's important. Florida's a big one and very important, but he's going to win Florida.
And hanging chads were hanging in the headlines.
Being able to get out and meet those people who are going to be running our country, that kind of gets your heart pounding because you want to know all these answers.
Not long after that, a day no one will ever forget.
Right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side.
9/11. I remember being in the control room when the first plane hit the tower, and we're going, what is going on? This is crazy. Wow, you know, we didn't know. We thought it was an accident. Then standing there watching as the second plane hit the tower, those things just stick with you. They because you're not a part of it, but in a sense you are. Because let's face it, the whole country was a part of it. But when you're the news, station that's delivering this news and helping people understand what's going on, it really impacts you.
The patriotism of the area only further solidified after 9/11, and war in the Middle East hit closer to home.
We are a large military community. We have the Navy base, we have the Coast Guard, we have Tyndall Air Force Base, we have Eglin, we have so many bases in this area.
In 2006, we covered a local Army captain, Sean English, who died serving in Iraq. And another young soldier serving in Iraq, Joshua Cope, who was severely injured when his tank rolled over an improvised explosive device. Our cameras were there as he was taken back to California for rehab. Cope's story started the Warrior Beach Retreat, a project that later became a mission to give injured servicemen and women the hero's welcome they deserve. And our area mourned another hero, Panama City Beach police officer Kevin Kite, killed on the job while pulling over Robert Bailey during spring break in March 2005. The early 2000s saw big things happening at a small college.
So little old Gulf Coast Community College, now Gulf Coast State College, is on the map, as are we, everybody, that surrounds the college, because of Coach Rooney Scoville and the Gulf Coast women's basketball program being a national powerhouse.
There were more ways to keep up with the big stories as the news started a shift from traditional TVs to the internet. WJHG.com was created, and news started to evolve in the digital landscape, keeping up with an explosion in technology from computers and cell phones.
How good do the files that are available via Napster sound? Like they're straight off of a CD.
And there's something new every day. You don't stop learning. Just because you've been in the business this long, you continue to learn.
Technology also improved in weather forecasting.
That was just a crazy time period because you had 2004, 2005, very busy hurricane seasons. And I remember, it was just, storms were just coming back to back. And Hurricane Ivan was a big deal.
Right there, tornado on the ground. Tornado on the ground. Roll tape on this, somebody. Roll tape on this. Get the newsroom involved with this. We have a tornado on the ground.
In 2004, meteorologist Jason Kelly followed tornadoes spawned by Hurricane Ivan, pinpointing their direction, giving viewers life-saving information.
And that was right when we got our new radar analysis tool that the station had purchased, and it was like literally right at that time.
We have multiple indications of rotations in this storm.
And Jason was able to use that and pinpoint those tornadoes as they all came on shore. Like I said, unfortunately, we lost several people lost their lives, but there's no telling how many lives we probably saved by having that. The ability to analyze the storms and pinpoint them before they were even on the coast.
The early 2000s saw a different kind of storm brewing along the beaches, as once again, spring break controversy threw Panama City Beach back into the national spotlight. And this time, the internet, websites, and .com revolution took the attention to a whole new level.
When Girls Gone Wild decided they wanted to come down here and have parties on the beach and film, it got out of control. It really got out of control.
I did nothing wrong here. My companies did nothing wrong. These girls are money grubbing whores, and that's what this case is about.
Joe Francis went to court, accused of filming underage girls during spring break for his Girls Gone Wild series. And while the beach was exploding, the Hathaway Bridge was imploding, paving the way for a new bridge to accommodate the growing traffic of a booming area.
And it took, I don't know, half an hour, 45 minutes, just so you and I talked. I remember that we just ended up talking for a very long time till they finally did, without incident, take down the old Hathaway Bridge.
WJHG anchor and reporter Jessica Foster remembers the changes she saw as she started her career in the local market.
The biggest change, growth in the area, just development. When I first came here, Pier Park wasn't even in existence. I remember one of the first stories that I ever covered was Miracle Strip closing. And it was supposed to be a big development on that piece of property. And I remember that being sad to me because I grew up vacationing here and I had great memories at Miracle Strip. That was one of the very first stories that I covered, though.
The early 2000s started the condo boom in Panama City Beach. Many mom and pops still standing were sold as investors started gobbling up real estate. And change was coming in other forms.
Protesters of all ages gathered Saturday at the grave of Martin Lee Anderson to end a week of protest.
National coverage once again hit the local market after the death of teenager Martin Lee Anderson at the Bay County Juvenile Detention Facility, which closed not long after that story broke. And stories about abuse at the Dozier School for Boys in Marianna came to light.
The signing of a consent decree by federal Judge Maurice Paul during July is expected to have a major impact on the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys.
That facility also ended up shutting down in 2011. Much of WJHG's coverage focused on the entire viewing area, including the small towns.
Our home's in there. And they said it's gone and my mom's house is gone and everybody's is gone.
As you can see behind me, this is Caryville's Town Hall, which is now about 5 feet underwater.
And I think it's very important that we spend as much time as we can out there telling their stories too.
We are the proud papas of a little girl.
WJHG's cameras were rolling when a gunman interrupted a Bay District School Board meeting in December 2010.
Please don't. Please don't. Please.
And it was just like a miracle happened and no one but the gunman was hurt. And I'm telling you that was one day that will always stick out in my mind, that God was watching out for them. And they will tell you the same thing.
Up next, we'll take you into the modern age at WJHG from 2010 to today, as our station grows with the area while leaning on lessons from the past, as seen through the lens at WJHG. The 2010s. The new airport landed in Bay County. More people moved to the area. And a different kind of storm hit the area.
It's a completely different scene compared to 1 year ago. We're not used to slick winter roads like these.
Meteorologist Ryan Michaels started at WJHG thinking he'd escaped winter weather.
I had just got done spending 3 years in Wisconsin forecasting winter weather for, 3/4 of the year when you're up in the tundra. And I came down here right before, about a couple months, right before that storm. And I just remember a lot of the area down here not being very familiar with winter forecasting.
If you're going to get winter weather, let's just go ahead and get snow. Let's just do 1989. Ice is terrible because you can't drive in it and it's nothing pretty to look at.
It's definitely a storm system to remember, and thankfully, it didn't cause too much damage to the area. Thankfully, we closed bridges. Thankfully, we did the necessary things that we could with what we had here in Bay County especially, and in the Panhandle to make sure that everybody was safe.
Oh yeah, yeah!
Safety became a big concern for the whole community by 2015, the year spring break finally hit its breaking point.
We're hearing of rapes on the beach, we're hearing of shootings, and then it just escalates through the years until Sheriff McKeithen decided he'd had enough and he put a stop to it.
As stories of gun violence grew around the country, our area was not immune.
Standing down behind these vehicles and okay, I'm not sure if you can hear that. Several shots are being fired as we speak.
Our cameras caught the tense moments as shots were fired off 23rd Street in 2018. But perhaps one of the biggest stories ever seen through the lens at WJHG happened just a few months later that same year.
I said, treat this like it was a tornado warning. We were on the air telling you a tornado because this is going to be stronger than a lot of tornadoes and it's much more massive. You just see the power of it and there's only so much you can do. I can't make people get out of the way of the storm, or I can't make the storm move. And what happened.
I'm glad that we got through the way we got through with the least amount of loss to human life that I think is probably possible with a Category 5 storm.
But covering the loss of homes, businesses, and seeing the community forever change was perhaps one of the most difficult stories to tell at WJHG.
And I remember just after that first day coming home and just sobbing, because just seeing the heartbreak and seeing my town, my community, just, oh my goodness, it was devastating.
Seeing it, because this is our home, and this is where we love, and it's just hard. It's just hard. When we were finally able to get out of the building, and you walk out and you're like, this is almost like a movie set because it doesn't seem real. And you're seeing all these images of destruction. And I remember just crying. I was on Facebook Live and the tears were flowing because we were human. We're journalists, but we're also human.
At that time, WJHG was needed for information, even though the devastation at the station made it a challenge.
But it was how we handled it after the fact, where there's like a second, you're off the air, and you're like, what do we do? And then you're all of a sudden, it's like, we can still broadcast. And, getting on social media and being able to do Facebook Live and everything. And it was very rudimentary. It may have been like literally holding up a phone to a phone, showing like where the storm was and what was going on. But we were able to get the job done.
Up next, the years after Michael into the pandemic as seen through the lens at WJHG, and how our station continues to evolve right along with the community.
70 Years with WJHG is sponsored in part by Peden.
As WJHG looks back over the past 70 years of coverage in Panama City, it doesn't have to look far to see some of its greatest challenges. While still recovering from Hurricane Michael, the pandemic brought a storm no one was prepared for, including local newsrooms.
Nisa, according to Florida's Department of Health, there are currently 184 people under public health monitoring and 8 pending test results here in Florida.
And then you also had the added pressure of keeping employees safe, trying to keep them from getting sick, while also doing our jobs, because news can't stop, especially when we have a national emergency. You have to keep going.
This is the testing kit they're using to test for COVID-19. It's called an e-swab.
It was tough to navigate. It was tough, and I know it was for, the bosses here, because they had to constantly be thinking, how can we tell this story? We became proficient at Zoom, things that I hated doing because I am not good with technology, but I learned doing the news from home. That was something different for us, but we made it through.
As the world changes, our station has changed too over the past 70 years. WJHG is the oldest original station owned by Gray Television that has never been sold. Starting off small, Gray has now grown into one of the country's largest media companies, with stations in 113 markets and a mission to keep local news evolving on every platform.
Back in the 70s and 80s, when I was here, Jimmy Gray, James Harrison Gray, WJHG, who was the founder of Gray Communications. He was just a man that I knew. He was a good friend. But now you think about it, that man started an empire.
An empire with a simple mission to keep locals informed. Mission accomplished for 70 years at WJHG, and a promise to keep doing it with honesty, ethics, and integrity for many years to come.